Please let us know where in the world you are listening from. Now relax and enjoy. A few years ago, I decided to take a walk through the woods. It wasn't a well-trodden path, just meandering wherever my curiosity led. The air was crisp, and everything was serene, or so I thought. Then, out of nowhere, I caught a whiff of this overpowering sweet smell. It wasn't pleasant, more sickly sweet, like overripe fruit, but worse. Being naturally curious, or maybe just nosy, I decided to investigate. I pushed back the dense undergrowth, expecting maybe a decaying animal or something mundane. But what I found was far from that. There, lying amongst the tangled branches and leaves, was a dead body. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. The man's body had been there for quite some time, judging by the state it was in. He was swollen, his skin mottled with greens and blacks, and there were parts of him that looked like they had turned to some kind of oozing mush. The smell was almost unbearable up close. It was clear that the local wildlife had discovered him before I had. Small creatures had clearly been making a meal of him for days. I stood there, frozen, before finally pulling myself together enough to call the police. When I explained what I'd found, they told me to stay put and wait for them to arrive. They warned me it might take a while, given how remote the area was. So there I sat, in the middle of nowhere, keeping vigil over this poor man's remains. The sun dipped lower and lower in the sky until eventually, darkness swallowed the woods. It was just me, the oppressive quiet of the forest at night, and him. I couldn't bring myself to look directly at him for too long, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked away, I'd somehow disrespect him, or worse, that he might move. Eventually, the police arrived, and they took over the scene. It turned out that the man had taken his own life. He must have chosen that secluded spot to ensure he wouldn't be found quickly, if at all. Even after they took him away, the experience stayed with me. It wasn't just the shock of finding a body, but the sense of sadness and loss that clung to the air around that place. In the days and weeks that followed, I began having vivid, unsettling dreams about him. In these dreams, he would talk to me, but not kindly. He seemed angry, furious, in fact. He'd tell me I had disturbed his resting place, that I shouldn't have called anyone, that he wanted me to end my own life. I told myself it was just my imagination, my subconscious processing the trauma of the event. Still, the dreams felt so real, so vivid, and I often woke up shaken. A few summers ago, I went out for a late-night bike ride with a friend. It was one of those perfect summer evenings where the air was warm, and the streets were quiet, almost eerily so. Riding around the city at midnight felt freeing, like the world was ours for a little while. My friend and I spent hours exploring, talking about everything and nothing, until we finally decided to call it a night. When we parted ways, I had only about 2 blocks to ride by myself back to my house. It didn't seem like a big deal. After all, it was my neighborhood, and I'd biked those streets hundreds of times before. What could go wrong? The ride was peaceful at first. The streets were dead, with hardly a car or person in sight. Because of some construction work on the roads, I had to ride on the sidewalk, but it wasn't a problem until I was just about to turn onto my street. That's when I noticed a man walking ahead of me. He was maybe in his 40s, a little scruffy looking, but not disheveled enough to seem homeless. He looked pretty typical for the area, really. We live in the downtown area of a medium-sized city, and there's a large population of mentally ill people around, but nothing about him immediately set off alarm bells. The sidewalk was pretty narrow, and I didn't want to startle him as I passed. I figured the polite thing to do would be to warn him that I was coming up behind him. So when I got about 6 feet away, I called out, "Hey, behind you." It wasn't loud or aggressive, just enough to let him know I was there. He turned around, and the look he gave me made my stomach drop. His face twisted into this furious expression, like I'd just committed some unforgivable sin by daring to speak to him. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do, but then I turned down my street as planned, hoping that was the end of it. It wasn't. As I pedaled away, I heard him shouting behind me, his voice growing louder and angrier with each passing second. He started screaming, hurling insults at me. "You fucking cunt," he yelled. "I'm going to kill you." I glanced over my shoulder and saw that he was following me. His steps were frantic, almost stumbling, but his speed wasn't the most terrifying part. It was his rage, unrelenting, wild, and completely unprovoked. I live right off the corner of that street, and my first instinct was to make a beeline for my house. But then it hit me, if I went straight home, he'd see where I lived. He wasn't just yelling empty threats, his fury felt real. I didn't want him knowing where I lived, where I slept. So instead, I decided to play it safe and do another loop around the block, hoping he'd lose interest or get distracted. As I rounded the block and came back to my street, I slowed down, trying to see if the coast was clear. That's when I spotted him. He was standing on my front stoop, staring out at the street. My heart stopped. It was like he knew that was my house. There was no hesitation in his posture, no wandering around to suggest he was just in the area by coincidence. He was planted there waiting, watching. He saw me as I rode by again, but this time he didn't yell. He didn't move. He just stood there, silent and ominous, like he was trying to intimidate me. And honestly, it worked. My pulse was pounding, my hands were shaking on the handlebars, and I felt trapped. I couldn't go home. I couldn't confront him. I didn't know what to do. In the end, I made the decision to head back to my friend's house instead. It was the safest option I could think of at the time. When I got there, I explained what had happened, my voice trembling as I recounted the details. We debated whether to call the police, but in the end I didn't. I couldn't explain why exactly, but part of me felt like they wouldn't take it seriously. Or worse, that they'd show up, find nothing, and the guy would come back to my house knowing I'd tried to report him. 2 days later, my bike was stolen from the alleyway behind my house. That was when my mom finally decided it was time to notify law enforcement. I wasn't so sure it was connected to the man, but the timing felt suspicious. It was the final piece that made the whole situation feel even more unsettling. The strangest thing about all of this was that the man didn't look out of place. If he'd seemed obviously disturbed or homeless, I might have been more cautious. But he looked so normal, completely unremarkable for the area. That's what made it so unnerving. You don't expect a seemingly average person to explode with such hostility over something as small as a polite warning on a bike ride. Even now, I replay that night in my head, wondering if I could have done anything differently. Maybe if I'd stayed quiet and just rode past him without saying anything, he wouldn't have noticed me at all. Or maybe I would have startled him anyway, and things would have played out the same, or worse. It's hard to say. I don't ride my bike at night anymore. I used to love the peacefulness of it, the way the city felt like it belonged only to me under the cover of darkness. But that sense of freedom has been tainted. Now every shadow feels like a threat, every quiet street like a trap. My uncle was always the kind of guy who could strike up a conversation with anyone, anywhere. He was friendly, approachable, and had a knack for finding common ground with people, even total strangers. So, it wasn't unusual that one night, while he was at a bar, he started chatting with this random guy. From the way he described it later, the guy seemed like a regular, nothing out of the ordinary. My uncle even went as far as to say, he was a really nice guy. They talked about the usual things, life, work, maybe sports, or the weather. Nothing too deep, but enough to form a casual connection. My uncle would see him again a few times at the same bar over the next couple of weeks. They'd drink, chat, and share a laugh or two. My uncle didn't think much of it. He figured he'd just made another drinking buddy. The guy didn't come across as creepy or strange, just a normal, sociable guy who liked to hang out and unwind after a long day. Then one day, the guy just stopped showing up. My uncle noticed, of course, but didn't dwell on it. People come and go in bars all the time. Maybe he'd moved away, found another spot to hang out, or just decided to cut back on drinking. Life went on, and my uncle didn't give it much more thought. Sometime later, it might have been a few months, maybe longer, my uncle got a notice for jury duty. Like most people, he wasn't thrilled about it, but he showed up as required. When he got to the courthouse and learned what the case was about, his stomach dropped. It was for the trial of a serial killer. And not just any serial killer. The guy on trial was his buddy from the bar. Derek Todd Lee. If you don't know who Derek Todd Lee is, he was a notorious serial killer who preyed on women in Louisiana in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The details of his crimes were horrifying, to say the least. He was linked to multiple murders and assaults, and his capture was a big deal at the time. To my uncle, though, this wasn't the infamous Baton Rouge serial killer. This was just the really nice guy he used to chat with over drinks. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He'd been sitting there, unwinding at the bar, sharing stories and laughs with a man who had done unspeakable things. It was almost too much to process. How could someone so seemingly normal, even likable, be capable of such evil? My uncle felt a mix of disbelief, unease, and oddly enough, guilt. He'd had no idea who this man really was, but the thought that he had unknowingly befriended a monster stuck with him. When it was time for jury selection, my uncle didn't even make it past the initial questioning. As soon as he explained his connection to Derek Todd Lee, he was promptly dismissed for obvious reasons. There was no way he could be impartial in a case like that, knowing what he knew and having had those personal interactions with the defendant. Afterward, my uncle told the family about the experience. He wasn't one to get easily rattled, but this clearly shook him. It wasn't just the shock of realizing who his bar buddy really was. It was the realization of how easily evil can blend in. Derek Todd Lee wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the dark. He was a man who could sit down, share a drink, and make himself seem entirely unremarkable. That's what made it so terrifying. I worked the midnight shift at a gas station, and have for quite some time now. Over the years, I've worked at various stations in different areas, each with its own unique character and challenges. Some locations were in relatively quiet neighborhoods, while others were in places where you had to keep one eye on the register and the other on the parking lot. The level of criminal activity varied, but working nights has always had an edge to it, no matter where I've been. You learn to stay vigilant, but you also adapt to the rhythm of the night, its regulars, its quiet moments, and sometimes its unsettling ones. As is the nature of the job, I've accumulated a lot of regular customers over the years. Many of them are kind, familiar faces who have become part of the routine. Some stop by to chat, while others keep their interactions brief but consistent. Being a small-statured woman, I often notice how these regulars keep a watchful eye out for me, especially during moments when the night feels a little too quiet or when someone shady lingers too long. My partner, who works the other half of the week, is also a small woman, so we've always relied on our instincts and the unofficial neighborhood watch of our regulars to feel a little safer. One regular stands out in particular. He was a middle-aged man who worked in the metro about an hour away. He came in every morning without fail to buy his cigarettes. He wasn't the chatty type, never smiled, never seemed particularly friendly. Just a man who stuck to his routine. As I often do with customers, I made it a small personal challenge to get him to smile one day. It wasn't about anything specific, just a small goal I set for myself in the long hours of the night. After months of brief, polite exchanges, I finally pulled it off. One morning, as he walked in, I already had his cigarettes ready on the counter, scanned and waiting for him to pay. That tiny bit of anticipation on my part did the trick. He smiled, a small, fleeting smile, but it was genuine, and it felt like a quiet little victory. Then, for the first time, he spoke beyond the usual pleasantries. "Do you ever get scared on the night shift?" he asked, his voice thick with an Eastern European accent. "You small girl is not safe." I admitted that, yes, sometimes I did feel nervous, but I reassured him that we had precautions. I explained how we could lock the doors if necessary, and that the provincial police often stopped by to wash their vehicles and check in. I told him I had a good rapport with them, and that it gave me some peace of mind. He nodded thoughtfully, then leaned in a little closer, as if to impart something important. What he said next left a lasting impression on me. He told me a story from when he first moved to our country with his wife and child back in the late 80s or early 90s. He had also worked midnight shifts at a gas station back then, trying to make ends meet in a new country. One night, he fell asleep while on the job. He admitted it almost sheepishly, like it was an embarrassing memory, but then his tone grew serious. When he woke up, the phone was ringing off the hook, and his manager was shaking him violently, asking if he was all right. He groggily assured his manager that he was fine and apologized for falling asleep. But his manager wasn't concerned about the nap. He was frantic, yelling at him to look outside. When he stepped out, he saw the aftermath of what had happened. The station had been ransacked. All the motor oil was gone, and the parking lot was a mess, evidence of a quick, chaotic theft. The thieves had hit the station while he was asleep, but had left him completely unharmed. It wasn't until later that he learned the full scope of the night's events. The same thieves had moved down the road to the next gas station, where the clerk was awake and tried to fight back. The thieves, ruthless and unhesitating, stabbed the clerk to death and left him to bleed out on the floor. As he told me this, his voice was steady, but there was a weight to his words that carried the gravity of that memory. When he finished the story, he looked me in the eye and said something that has stuck with me ever since. "If you ever feel sleepy, just lock the door and do it. It might save your life." The way he said it wasn't dramatic or overly emotional. It was matter of fact, as if this was a lesson he had learned the hard way and was passing on to me. That simple advice hit me in a way that few things ever have. In this line of work, you hear stories, warnings, and tales of bad nights. But something about the way he shared this, a quiet, personal story meant to keep me safe, felt different. It wasn't a general cautionary tale. It was his truth, offered to me because he cared, in his own way, about the little gas station clerk who always had his cigarettes ready. I don't work at that station anymore. Life moved me on to another location, and eventually out of the job entirely. One of my childhood friends had a beach house, and every now and then, I was lucky enough to get invited. It wasn't just a regular beach house either. This place was massive, the kind of house that made you stop and think, wow, this family really has money. It wasn't over-the-top fancy, but it had this effortless, luxurious vibe that made it clear they weren't struggling. The layout was amazing, with huge windows that let in tons of natural light and a balcony that gave you an incredible view of the ocean. To top it off, they even had a full-time maid who lived on-site in her own little flat tucked away at the back of the property. To a kid like me, the whole setup felt like something out of a movie. One weekend, my friend's family decided to head to the beach house for a long weekend. It had been a while since they'd visited, and they were looking forward to some downtime by the water. But when they got there and opened the door, everything immediately felt off. The place had been completely ransacked. The living room, the kitchen, everywhere they looked was a mess. Furniture was overturned, TVs and electronics were missing, and broken glass and debris were scattered all over. It was chaos. They stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had happened. After the initial shock wore off, they decided to check on the maid. She'd lived in that little flat for years, and they wanted to make sure she was okay. But when they got to her quarters, the flat was completely empty. All of her belongings were gone, clothes, personal items, everything. It was as if she had packed up and vanished. Naturally, the family panicked. They called the cops, who came by to assess the situation. The officers took a quick look around and, judging by their attitude, didn't seem particularly invested in the case. After hearing about the missing maid, they told the family that it was likely an inside job. Their theory was that she'd either planned the whole thing or had been involved somehow. Maybe she'd tipped someone off, or maybe she'd taken advantage of the family's trust and decided to cash in. That's what everyone believed, for a while at least. For the next week, the family was stuck dealing with the fallout. The police didn't seem too interested in pursuing the case further, so the parents had to handle the practical stuff on their own. Insurance claims, cleaning up the house, and figuring out how to secure the property. Everyone was convinced that the maid had been behind it. It was the simplest explanation, and no one really questioned it. My friend's parents were upset, of course, but more than anything, they seemed resigned to the idea that they'd been betrayed. The following weekend, the dad decided to go back to the house alone to continue the cleanup and change the locks. This time, he brought their dogs along with him for some company. The dogs loved the beach house. They'd always run around the yard and splash in the pool whenever the family visited. It seemed like a good idea, something to make the grim task of securing the house a little less lonely. While the dad was working, one of the dogs started acting strangely. It was digging furiously near a tarp that had been left by the pool. At first, the dad didn't think much of it. Dogs dig all the time, especially in sandy areas like the backyard of the beach house. But this wasn't just playful digging. The dog was fixated, almost frantic, clawing at the ground like it was trying to uncover something important. Curious and a little uneasy, the dad went over to check it out. As he got closer, he noticed the smell, a faint but unmistakable odor that made his stomach drop. He pulled the dog away and started digging himself, and that's when he found it. Beneath the tarp, buried in the yard, was the maid's body. She'd been wrapped up and hidden there, left to decompose in the place she'd once called home. The discovery sent shockwaves through the family. The police were called back to the scene, and the investigation took a sharp turn. It was no longer a simple case of theft or betrayal. Now it was something much darker. The theory quickly shifted. Whoever had broken into the house must have known the maid. Maybe she'd recognized them or caught them in the act, and they'd decided she was a liability. She hadn't vanished willingly. She'd been silenced. The realization was devastating. The family had trusted her, lived alongside her for years, and now she was gone in the most brutal, senseless way imaginable. The dad, in particular, was haunted by the fact that her body had been there the entire time, hidden in plain sight while they'd been searching for answers. For weeks afterward, the family struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The police launched a more thorough investigation, but as far as I know, they never caught the people responsible. The case faded into the background, overshadowed by other news and other crimes, leaving the family with more questions than answers. They sold the beach house not long after. It had been a place of joy and relaxation, a symbol of their success, but after what happened, they couldn't bear to keep it. Even now, years later, the story sticks with me. It's not just the horror of what happened, but the eerie way it all unfolded. At first, it seemed like just another burglary, a crime of opportunity, something unfortunate but not unheard of. Then it turned into something far more sinister, a reminder that sometimes the simplest explanations hide the darkest truths. The thought that the maid had been there, buried in the yard while everyone assumed she'd run off, is something that still gives me chills. The other night my wife had taken our 1-year-old out for a few hours, leaving me some rare time to myself. I wrapped up work around 4:30 p.m. and decided to pick up dinner while I had the chance. By the time I got home at 6:30, the house was calm and quiet. I played with our dog for a bit, knocked out a few chores, and waited for my wife and child to return. They got home around 7:30 p.m., and the three of us settled into our usual routine. After dinner and some downtime, I headed to bed early around 9 p.m. Since I'm usually the one up early with our little one, getting a head start on sleep is essential. I crawled into bed, ready to call it a day. Maybe 2 minutes later, just as I was starting to get comfortable, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my wife, which struck me as odd since I had just left her in the living room. The text included a picture of something that immediately sent a chill down my spine: our dry erase menu board on the fridge. Every week, at the start of the week, my wife writes out a rough menu of our planned dinners. I had seen it earlier in the day, neatly filled out in her handwriting, as it always was. But in the picture she sent me, it was completely scrambled. The letters and words were jumbled around, with random squiggles and incomplete phrases filling the board. Some of it still looked like her handwriting, but much of it didn't. Words had been rewritten or partially erased in handwriting that wasn't hers or mine. I got out of bed and walked to the kitchen, where my wife was staring at the board, visibly unsettled. We both knew our 1-year-old wasn't capable of doing something like that, and we'd been out of the house for hours. Neither of us could explain it. The realization set in quickly: someone else must have been in our home. The thought of an intruder was terrifying. We live out in the country, in a quiet, secluded area where things like this just don't happen. We called the county sheriff immediately, and they sent someone out to investigate. While we waited for them to arrive, we carefully checked all the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. Nothing seemed out of place, no broken locks, no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be missing. When the sheriff arrived, he swept the house thoroughly. He went room by room, checking every possible hiding place. He didn't find anyone or anything unusual, but he admitted the situation was strange. The board's scrambled writing clearly bothered him too. He told us that calls from our part of the county were almost non-existent. It was rare for them to be dispatched out here at all. Before leaving, the sheriff gave us a piece of advice that hit harder than it should have: change the locks. He pointed out that we hadn't updated them since moving in, and the elderly couple we'd bought the house from could have easily passed spare keys to friends, family, or even workers over the years. It wasn't a comforting thought, but it made sense. We'd assumed the quietness of the area was security enough, but now we realized how much we had taken that for granted. That night, we didn't waste any time. We drove into town, bought new locks, and changed them immediately. By the time we were done, it was well past midnight. The house felt different, still ours, but with an underlying sense of unease. In the days since, my wife and I haven't been able to stop replaying the events in our minds, trying to figure out what could have happened. Was it a prank? Someone with a key and a warped sense of humor? Or was it something more sinister? A sign that someone had been watching us and knew we weren't home? No matter how much we think about it, we can't come up with an answer that feels complete. The menu board itself haunts me. It wasn't just erased or blank. The letters and words were moved around, rearranged in a way that seemed deliberate yet nonsensical. It wasn't the kind of thing someone would do in a hurry. It felt calculated, like someone wanted us to find it and wonder. Our dog didn't bark or act strangely that night, which was another odd detail. He's usually alert and quick to react to anything unusual. Did that mean whoever it was had been here before? Was our dog used to their presence? The more questions we ask, the fewer answers we seem to have. Living in the country, we always felt a certain level of safety. It's quiet, removed from the hustle of the city, and the kind of place where you can leave your doors unlocked without a second thought, or so we believed. This incident has changed that. We've tightened up our security, not just with the locks but with other precautions too. Cameras are next on our list. The sheriff called back a few days later to follow up, but there wasn't much else to report. They hadn't received any other calls in the area, and there was no indication of a broader threat. That should have been reassuring, but it only made the whole thing feel more unsettling. It has taken me many years to tell this story out of both fear and embarrassment. I share this today as more than simply therapy for myself, but as a warning to all people. Be careful who you meet on social media. In 2018, my ex-husband and I were at the end of a very tumultuous marriage. He and I had been polyamorous for about 3 years before I met this guy. His name was Jez. I met Jez on OkCupid. I was 28 and he was 42. We hit it off very quickly. After a few weeks of talking, I agreed to meet up with him at a restaurant close to my house. We sat and talked for a few hours before I invited him over to meet my husband. Things went very well, and they seemed to get along, so Jez and I started dating. This guy completely swept me off my feet. Drew was sweet and caring. He enthusiastically listened to every little thing on my mind, engaged and validated me. Over and over again, he absolutely revered me for my strength and wisdom. He practically worshipped me for all that I was and all I was becoming. He showered me with gifts, flowers, and random good deeds just to make me feel safe, wanted, and cared for. I had never been in a relationship that felt quite like that. It was wonderful. It was as though we had been looking for each other for years. After the first few weeks, he had a meltdown over my polyamorous nature. He pulled the plug because he said he was already falling for me and couldn't handle sharing me. I stood my ground and accepted this boundary and the fact that I would have to let him go. I left that night sad but confident that I had done the right thing for the both of us. That next week he sent me flowers and a card to my workplace, begging for another chance and reassuring me that he would rather try than not and end up regretting it. Even though it was scary, he wanted to take this journey with me. We continued dating, and it was just as wonderful. Long nights we spent awake talking, sharing, laughing, love-making, and planning. We went places and did things that I had always wanted to do. Then in the deepest, most intimate moments, when we would just sit in silence, he would grip my hand to his face in solidarity and astonishment, asking, "Where I've been all this time." Our time together was effortless. We fit together like puzzle pieces. By August of 2018, my marriage had ended, by no fault of Jez's, and by October, my husband had moved out. I was on a lease at the time and knew I couldn't afford the place on my own, so finding a roommate was essential. I had no support system to fall back on, nor did anyone else I know need a place at the time, so Jez offered to move in. Even then I was hesitant. We had only been together about 4 months, and I knew everything always changes when you move in with a partner. Despite my hesitation, I agreed. He was wonderful to me. How bad could it be? I was not prepared for the change that was to come. It was literally like night and day. Jez suddenly became a different person. He was extremely controlling, jealous, and lazy. Nothing like the person I thought I had met. And the way he treated me progressively got worse and worse. Hanging out with friends became a burden, if not impossible, because he would blow up my phone, guilting me about leaving him alone or not involving him in some way. Yet when I tried to, it was also treated as a burden and inconvenience, as he would huff and puff his way through even the concept of leaving space for anyone but ourselves. In December of 2018, we attended my work Christmas party. I had given him the option whether he wanted to go or not. It was really neither here nor there for me, especially because I had already learned that he really didn't do well if he felt pressured into social situations. I opened the invitation to him because he had expressed to me over and over that it was important for him that he was involved in my social life. For the full month he knew about it, he insisted that he wasn't going. I took it as him being introverted and didn't push the issue. I let him know that I would make sure he felt welcome if he decided to go, but not to feel obligated. I was surprised when he changed his mind at the last minute and insisted on going, and even more stunned when we went and he actively acted as though he did not want to be there. Everyone there was incredibly welcoming and included him in the festivities and conversation. However, he still practically grumbled the entire night about the whole thing, mumbling insults and critiquing every little part of the party under his breath, as though being there was absolutely awful to have to endure. No one really seemed to notice the low whispering insults and gripes. At one point, after a couple of glasses of wine, my direct manager leaned into Jez and started praising him. She and I were very close, therefore she was intimately familiar with what I had gone through with my ex-husband. "I am so happy she has you. She bleated through wine happy. You have been absolutely transformative for her." It's so nice to see her finally happy and appreciated. Without missing a beat, Jez grimaced at the comment and quickly snapped back, "You don't fucking know me." I honestly didn't believe my ears. It was one of those moments where time stops, and you just know you couldn't have heard that correctly. I sat brewing on it for a minute before another light-hearted interaction with Jez prompted him to suddenly snap at me through grit teeth. "Stop it." This triggered me and I lost it. I pulled him outside and asked him what his problem was. I called out his behavior and told him if he was going to act that way then, he could just leave. That if he didn't want to be there, he should have stayed home. He ended up giving a sort of half-assed apology, and we went back inside and finished the party. I remember the drive home that night, staring out the dark window at nothing in particular in worried silence. I might have messed up, was my only thought through the entire drive. This all started out slow, of course, like waving me away or invalidating my experiences and ideas due to my age, that I was just dramatizing my experiences because I was young, etc. The man who, not 6 months prior, had validated me, my trauma, and experiences to the ends of the earth. Now every time I started a story or tried to share anything, even trying to plan out meals for the week, he would openly show annoyance as though I was violating his time and attention. Before I knew it, he was snapping at me over every little thing. If I asked how his day was or talked about my day, I would aggressively shut it down. "Why do you always ask me that? I don't want to talk shop at home. I really don't care about your work. It's work." Before I knew it, I couldn't even bring him a plate of breakfast without being snapped at. It was as though he was testing me. When Jez and I first started dating, he flat out refused to talk about most all of his exes. He refused to name them or discuss any of the issues or lessons learned. They didn't matter, he would claim. They weren't in his life for a reason. It was the same reasoning he also used in reference to my more recent exes, talking about them, including my now ex-husband may as well have become off limits. Anytime I brought up either of our exes, he would become incredibly agitated, belittling, and just overall very aggressive. I took this as both an age gap issue, as I have a tendency to dwell, as well as insecurity and a threat to the life he was trying to build. However, after he moved in and this hot-button topic had been established several times, he would bring up his exes and how they looked, telling me on more than one occasion he would have never dated me back in the day, and that I was lucky he lowered his standards. I didn't even really know what to say to this. I would laugh it off and shove it in my back pocket. Noted. He then started bringing up my looks and accusing me of catfishing him. I had stopped taking care of myself due to the isolation and had also put on some weight, so most of my clothes that I had once felt great in no longer fit. And since Jez had also been dishonest with me about his financial position, he was always needing extra money here and there, leaving me broke almost all of the time. A horrible tragedy happened that following summer, while Jez and I were together. I received notice that a good friend I went to art school with shot himself in the head while tripping on LSD. Our whole class was devastated. He was, without contest, the best photographer of our class and one of the most kind-hearted individuals I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. Also, as someone who is very familiar with LSD, I was rocked. Jez, however, was far from supportive. He pretty much immediately shrugged it off. That's life. I guess that's what he gets for fucking around with LSD. I was baffled at such an unsympathetic response, and even more later when Jez started to interrogate me about my relationship with this guy, asking when the last time it was that I had even talked to this friend. "You don't even know this guy anymore." "Who cares?" I broke up with him the first time after he called me at work raging. I was busy, so I wasn't able to answer right away, but once I was finally able to answer, I was met with intense anger. It was storming and one of my dogs was having an anxiety attack due to storm and separation anxiety. This wasn't the first time, and he was well aware of what she needed in those moments. "Why the fuck aren't you answering my calls? You answer when I call you. I don't care where you are." He went on for a few minutes, calling me a shitty girlfriend and laying into me over my sudden distance and lack of communication while I was at work. At this point, I was done and I lost it. I tore into him over everything, especially causing problems for me at work. That being in my life is a privilege, and if he's going to wake up every day acting like he hates me, then I don't know what on earth he's even doing with me. I told him that I expected him to get his things and leave. He was always threatening to go back to his old roommates where there was still a room. I didn't want him there when I got home, and we could coordinate times for him to come and get the rest. He flat refused, suddenly victimizing himself, claiming he had nowhere to go. "How dare you make me fall in love with you? How dare you take me to meet your father, and then dump me? My manager and her husband ended up following me home that evening because she was concerned for my safety and had offered to let me stay with her for a few days. I will never forget the scene I walked into, like Theon Greyjoy begging for his life. My boss stood next to me, watching as this 42-year-old man crawled on his knees before me, begging for mercy and communication. At one point, wrapping his arms around my legs, crying into them, "I can't believe this is happening. She's the love of my life, you know that," he cried to my boss. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. This was the antithesis of the heartless person I had been spending my days with. I shook him off and went to the back of the house, gathering enough of my things to get me through the next few days, as well as any and all valuables I could think of. It took a few days, but after about a week, Jez started blowing up my phone, apology after apology. Suddenly, he was the man I met again, full of humility and self-awareness. He acknowledged the awful way he had treated me and sent me walls and walls of well-thought-out messages, psychoanalyzing his own behavior, where it comes from, and the ways he knows it needs to change. I took him back. Like a dumb, desperate girl, I took him back. It wasn't long into this second round that he started to guilt me over the breakup. My panic had damaged his relationship with the people in my life, and he made sure that I knew it was my responsibility to fix it. It wasn't long after this that my car ended up breaking down at a gas station close to home. There was a very nice couple in the vehicle next to me that came to my rescue and checked things out under my hood. The gentleman turned out to be a mechanic for a living, so he had a pretty good theory about what could potentially be going on. By this time I had already attempted to contact Jez to let him know what was going on and where I was. It wasn't long till he got off work, so he told me to sit tight and he would be there shortly. Meanwhile, this sweet couple stayed put and kept me company while I waited. Jez barreled in about 15 minutes later, completely ignoring the couple that had helped me. Touching base, the gentleman handed me a slip of paper with a name and phone number on it, reviewing what he thought was going on with my car. Before Jez butted in, cutting him off, I said, "She's fine," he snapped. I could see the woman out of the corner of my eye slink away at this comment and get into the passenger seat of their car. I could feel the sudden tension, like maybe she's been here before. The gentleman didn't move and shifted his attention to me as Jez walked into the store. I could see he was clearly concerned. "Are you okay?" he asked in a low, almost whisper. "You don't have to answer that, but if you need anything." He looked down at the number in my hand and nodded to it seriously. With that, he got into the driver's seat of his car and drove away. I've thought about that couple countless times since that night. Everything went right back to the way it was before, as though the initial breakup never even happened. The same eggshells, the same belittling. If anything, it was worse, because I had permanently damaged our relationship. If I had just not been so dramatic, if I didn't run away from everything, then maybe he wouldn't have to work so hard for respect in my life. I had awesome parents who let me sleep in the living room on weekend nights when I was little. It was a big deal for me back then because my sister was a light sleeper, and it meant I could stay up until dawn watching TV without disturbing her. I'd curl up on the couch with my blanket, flipping through channels, and Nick at Night usually kept me company until I passed out. Of course, no matter how hard I tried to stay awake, the late-night reruns always wore me down, and I'd eventually drift off, cocooned in the comforting glow of the screen. One particular night, something broke that routine in a way I'll never forget. I don't know what time it was, but it was late. Everyone else in the house was asleep, and I was passed out on the couch as usual. Then out of nowhere, I was hit by this prickly feeling, an instinct that jolted me awake. I shot upright, sitting bolt straight and staring out the front window. We lived in rural Georgia, surrounded by trees as far as the eye could see. On a clear night, the moonlight would filter through the branches, casting everything in this eerie silver glow. That's exactly what it looked like when I woke up. And in that perfect moonlight, I saw it. Someone perched up in one of those trees. It was just a silhouette, but it was unmistakably human. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't look away, as though breaking eye contact with that shadowy figure would somehow make everything worse. Before I could even think about what to do, our family dog, who had been sleeping on the floor, suddenly dashed to the window. He started barking and snarling, pressing his nose against the glass. That sound, it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. He wasn't just barking, he was furious. Terrified, I jumped off the couch and bolted down the hall to my parents' room. I shook them awake, tears streaming down my face, trying to explain what I'd seen. There's someone outside. In the tree. I could barely get the words out between sobs, but my dad didn't need much convincing. He grabbed something for defense, a bat, I think, and rushed outside with the dog hot on his heels. I stayed back with my mom, clinging to her and trembling as we waited for Dad to come back. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes before he returned. He looked calm, almost too calm, as he told us he hadn't seen anyone. "Probably just your imagination," he said, trying to soothe me. "Go back to bed. It's fine." But it didn't feel fine. I couldn't bring myself to stay in the living room anymore, so I decided to sleep in my regular bedroom. My sister woke up when I crawled into bed, and I told her everything that had happened. She listened quietly, her wide eyes reflecting the same fear I was feeling, and tried to reassure me. Meanwhile, Dad was still on edge, pacing the house with a cup of coffee and checking the locks. Knowing he was keeping watch should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was still out there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I started to think maybe it was over. Dad's footsteps slowed, the house was quiet, and my sister's breathing had evened out as she drifted back to sleep. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was okay now. I could sleep, but I was wrong. I don't know why I opened my eyes again, but when I did, I saw him. The man. He was standing outside my bedroom window. The moonlight illuminated him enough for me to make out his face, and I swear it's burned into my memory to this day. He was looking directly at me, and when he realized I'd seen him, he raised a finger to his lips in a shushing gesture. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, but I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as he turned and ran. He didn't sneak away or try to hide. He just ran, straight and fast, disappearing into the darkness. The second he was gone, the terror hit me full force. I burst into tears, sobbing so hard I couldn't catch my breath. My sister woke up again, startled by my crying, and I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words came out jumbled. She got up and ran to get our parents. By the time they came in, I was still hysterical, and all I could do was point at the window. Dad checked outside again, but just like before, he found nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my parents' room, curled up next to my mom, shaking and crying every time I thought about that man. The way he had just stood there watching me, and the deliberate way he shushed me before running. It was the most unnerving thing I'd ever experienced. It wasn't random. He wanted me to see him. He wanted to scare me. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep unless my dad double-checked every lock in the house and made rounds through the yard. Even then, I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the windows, half expecting to see him again. I never did, but that didn't stop me from imagining him out there, lurking in the shadows. Back in November 2007, my buddy stumbled across what seemed like the deal of a lifetime. He found an ad from a guy giving away a brand new Xbox 360, complete with all the extras, controllers, Halo 3, and even a couple of sports games. The price? Absolutely free. All you had to do was go pick it up. Naturally, my friend figured there had to be a catch, but since the pickup address was in a nice part of town, he decided to give it a shot. After all, what was the worst that could happen? When he got there, the guy opened the door, and sure enough, the Xbox 360 was legit. Still shiny and new, with all the packaging intact. My friend couldn't believe his luck. But before he could load it up and leave, the guy dropped the condition. He wanted to keep all the boxes, packing materials, and game cases. My friend paused for a second, confused, and asked why. That's when the guy explained his plan. He wasn't just getting rid of an Xbox 360. He was preparing for Christmas morning. According to him, he was going to rewrap the empty boxes and give them to his son. The catch? Inside the packaging, instead of the console and games, there would be coal. My friend said the guy's face and tone made it clear. This wasn't a joke. Whatever the kid had done, the father believed he deserved it. At that point, my friend figured it wasn't his place to ask any questions. He just nodded, thanked the guy, and left with the Xbox and games in hand. On his way home, though, he couldn't help but turn the situation over in his mind. What kind of kid earns themselves coal on Christmas in such a brutal way? And what must have happened in that family for this man to go to such lengths? The guy had seemed calm, not angry or vindictive, almost like he believed this was some sort of tough love lesson his son desperately needed. Whatever it was, my friend wasn't sticking around to find out. For the next few months, we played a lot of Halo 3. That console got plenty of use, and it became the centerpiece of our gaming sessions. We'd stay up late, trash talking over matches, getting way too competitive, and laughing until our stomachs hurt. It was the kind of fun you don't realize you'll miss until you're looking back on it years later. The Xbox was one of those things that defined that era of our friendship, and it came with one hell of a story attached to it. But no matter how much fun we had, there was always this lingering thought in the back of my mind. That poor kid. I couldn't stop picturing what that Christmas morning must have been like. Imagine waking up as a kid, seeing a beautifully wrapped box under the tree, and thinking you've just scored the gaming system of your dreams. You'd tear into the paper, heart racing, already imagining all the games you'd play. And then Cole. I'd wonder about the kid. Did he deserve it? Was he a bratty, entitled teenager who had pushed his parents to the limit? Or was this punishment way over the top, more about the dad's frustrations than anything the kid had actually done? We never found out, of course, but the story stuck with me. I think what made it so haunting was the deliberate nature of it. This wasn't some offhand decision to toss Cole in a stocking. The dad had put real thought into it. He'd gone out of his way to rewrap the packaging, to make it look like the ultimate gift, only to set his son up for maximum disappointment. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a dark comedy or some cruel holiday prank show, but this was real life. The strangest part of it all was how normal the guy seemed when my friend described him. He wasn't ranting about his son's behavior or laughing maniacally about the plan. He was calm and matter of fact, like this was the most logical course of action for dealing with whatever his son had done. Maybe he was right. Maybe the kid really had pushed things too far. Or maybe the dad was just mean-spirited and out of touch. Either way, it wasn't exactly the kind of feel-good Christmas story you'd share over eggnog. About a week after getting my CPR certification, I found myself in a situation I'll never forget. Trying to save a woman who was dying of what I'm pretty sure was a heroin overdose. It was one of those surreal, overwhelming moments that hits you out of nowhere and stays with you long after it's over. I was at a thrift store with some friends, hunting for Halloween costumes. It was supposed to be a laid-back afternoon of joking around and trying on goofy outfits. We were spread out around the store when someone rushed in and shouted that a woman had passed out in the parking lot. I was in the dressing room at the time and didn't catch the initial commotion. But then everything went quiet. That kind of silence where you know something serious is happening. When I came out to see what was going on, someone said they thought the woman needed help. That's when I told them I was CPR certified and would take a look. I told someone to call 911, and I headed outside. I expected to find someone lying on the pavement or slumped over, maybe needing basic assistance. What I found was far worse. At first, I didn't see anyone. A bystander pointed out a car parked far out in the lot by itself. I ran over, and as I got closer, my stomach dropped. Through the car window, I saw her. She was slumped against the driver's side window, completely blue in the face. Her skin had that lifeless, oxygen-deprived look. I'd seen diagrams and videos in my CPR training, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. It was immediately clear that she was in serious trouble, probably already gone. A couple of us opened the car door, and the reality of the situation hit even harder. The inside of the car was a wreck. Heroin needles and empty pill bottles littered the floor. The smell of old sweat and chemicals was overwhelming. She looked so small and fragile, like whatever had led her to this moment had completely consumed her. I noticed she had the red rings around her eyes that you hear about with drug use, but even those were blue from how oxygen-deprived she was. The worst part, though, was when we turned her head to check for a pulse. That's when I saw the tears running down her face. That detail broke something in me. Even though she was unconscious, or possibly already dead, she had been crying before it happened. Whatever pain she had been carrying with her, it was still there, etched into her expression, frozen in time. We pulled her out of the car and laid her on the pavement. Someone else checked her pulse again, just to be absolutely sure before starting CPR. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough for us to act. I got down and started chest compressions. It was harder than I expected. In training, you're practicing on a dummy, and there's no emotional weight to it. Here, I was pressing down on this woman's chest, hearing the slight cracking sound of her ribs under the force, and it felt like I was fighting a losing battle against time. The ambulance arrived about a minute later, though it felt like much longer. The paramedics quickly took over, working with the kind of speed and coordination that comes from experience. They got her strapped onto a stretcher and continued CPR as they loaded her into the ambulance. Another ambulance showed up shortly after, and more EMTs joined in. At one point, there were 6 of them surrounding her, doing everything they could. A police officer on the scene pulled me aside and explained what they were doing. They had administered Narcan, the drug that can reverse opioid overdoses if given in time. He said it was their best shot, but given her condition, it was likely too late. They'd keep working on her until they got to the hospital, but he made it clear that the outcome didn't look good. As they worked, I noticed more details about her car. There was a car seat in the back, along with a few scattered toys. On her arm, she had tattoos with 2 names, likely her kids. That hit me like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just a random stranger overdosing in a parking lot. She was someone's mother, and those kids, those names on her arm, would wake up one day soon and realize she wasn't coming back. The thought was unbearable. The paramedics eventually left, and the parking lot grew quiet again. I stood there, replaying everything in my mind. The blue of her face, the tears, the needles on the floor. It was so much to process. My friends tried to comfort me, but I was in a daze, just trying to make sense of what had happened. I never found out what happened to her. The officer's words stuck with me, though, pretty much dead already. Maybe she passed away in the ambulance. Maybe they got her to the hospital and managed to bring her back for a little while. Either way, I couldn't shake the image of her face or the weight of her story, the parts one knew and the parts I'd never know. I've flown with my 1-year-old solo nearly a dozen times. Usually people are understanding/kind about me having a baby on my lap, and overall he's a happy, easy baby. He's also very cute, so it's not uncommon for strangers to talk to him. Usually I don't mind. The last trip I took, I sat alone in my aisle, with a man sitting by himself directly behind me. My baby was tired and fussing. I knew he was tired, but there's not a lot I could do until after we took off. Right out the gate, the man behind was talking to my baby, saying, "Oh hi baby. Why sad baby? Cute baby." I smiled and replied that he was tired, sorry for the fuss, thank you. After takeoff, I started to get him settled for a nap. The man behind us continued to talk to my baby, putting his hand through the seats to try and grab his feet. Multiple times I asked him nicely to please stop. My baby was tired, you're distracting him, he just needs a nap. Finally, I set my baby down next to me. He stood on the floor facing the seat next to me, so that I could make a bottle. The man behind me stood up and reached over my seat to pick him up. I immediately leaned forward to pick up baby, saying, "No thank you. I don't need help. Please no thank you." The man pushed me back into my seat while mumbling, "Sweet baby, why baby cry?" I replied very loudly "No," and quickly picked up my baby. I thought that was the end of that. I was wrong. I tried to rock my baby to sleep, while desperately trying not to lose my cool. As I'm rocking baby, the man behind me reached through our seats to grab my arm, saying, no rocking, you make him cry." I pulled free from him and yelled, "Do not touch me." Again, I thought that'd be the end. I started rocking baby for a second time. This time, the man behind me reached both hands around either side of my seat to hold me in place, saying, no rocking, stop rocking." I am somewhat embarrassed that I completely lost it. Clutching my baby to my chest while struggling to get free of him, it hurt. I hit the call light while screaming, "Let me go. Do not touch me, let me go." He was still holding me by my arms when the flight attendants came running. I could barely get anything out to the flight attendants. Everyone around us was staring, I was sobbing, and all I could get out was that I could not sit there anymore, and for the love of God, please move me. The man behind me tried to move with me, but I told the flight attendants that I did not know him, and he could not come with me. I had a good cry in my new seat, but my baby immediately went to sleep. I was moved to be next to the flight attendants' seats. After calming down, I explained to the flight attendants what had happened. Multiple times, the man that had been behind me got up to try to come back to my new seat, only to be turned around by one of the flight attendants. Towards the end of the flight, one of the flight attendants told me that they'd explained everything to the pilot, and the pilot had called the FBI and local police to escort the man off the flight. I would also be escorted off, as well as everyone around us that had watched everything happen. He cheered as he was escorted off. I had to interview with the FBI, and nearly missed my next flight. After my trip was done, I had to fly back going through the same airport. It was stressful and emotional to say the least, even knowing that he was banned from the airline and the airport. I haven't flown since. On a whim one evening, I decided to see if anyone nearby was selling Legos. It wasn't something I planned or really needed to do, but let's face it, 10-year-old me would have lost his mind over the idea of owning a massive collection of Legos, and as an adult, I now had the means to make that childhood dream come true. I thought, why not? Let's see what's out there. I started scrolling through local listings, the way you do when you're not really expecting to find anything. Most of the posts were exactly what I expected. Some old bricks, half-assembled sets, or single sets that were way overpriced. It was the usual mix of people clearing out their closets or trying to cash in on nostalgia. But then, I stumbled across something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a guy selling what looked like a good-sized lot of Legos for just $120. From the photos, I could see it was a mix of new and older pieces, and it definitely seemed like a bargain for the price. I couldn't believe it hadn't been scooped up already, so I immediately messaged the seller. He replied quickly, saying someone else was interested but hadn't committed yet. The ad had only been up for 45 minutes. I told him, no hesitation, that I'd definitely buy the lot if he could hold it for me for a couple of days until we could meet up. He agreed, and just like that, I had the deal locked down. Fast forward a couple of nights later, and I found myself pulling into a parking lot to meet the guy. We exchanged pleasantries, your standard polite small talk about the weather and traffic, and then got down to business. He popped open the trunk of his car, and I was not prepared for what happened next. First, he pulled out a large Rubbermaid bin full of Legos. That alone was worth the $120 in my eyes. But then he pulled out a second Rubbermaid, and then a third. At this point, I was trying to play it cool, but internally I was already doing mental calculations about how much this haul might actually be worth. Then he started handing over shoe boxes packed with bricks and pieces. And as if that wasn't enough, he brought out unopened sets. Yes, unopened sets. I started loading everything into my car, and it quickly became clear just how massive this lot was. At one point, I grabbed a random set from the stack and saw it was a police station from just a few years ago. I knew for a fact that set alone started at $120 when it was new, so with just that one box, I'd already broken even. And the guy just kept pulling out more. By the time everything was loaded into my car, it was clear this was far beyond what I'd imagined. I drive a PT Cruiser, and with the back seats folded down, this guy managed to fill the back 2/3 of my car up to my shoulders with Legos. It was an absolute mountain of bricks, sets, and pieces. I almost couldn't believe my luck. The seller seemed like a genuinely nice guy. He clearly had no idea how much all of it was worth. From what he told me, he was just clearing out his kids' old toys, assuming he was selling them to another dad for their kids. He mentioned his kids hadn't played with the Legos in years, and he just wanted the space back in his garage. I didn't have the heart to tell him he could have easily charged 10 times as much for the lot and still found a buyer. When I got home, I started sorting through everything, and the sheer scale of it hit me all over again. There were massive builds partially disassembled, unopened sets in mint condition, and thousands of loose bricks. It was like every Lego collector's dream in one giant haul. I wasn't just looking at a pile of toys, I was looking at a treasure trove. I spent the next few hours cataloging everything and doing a rough estimation of its value. All in all, the collection was worth at least $2,000, probably more if I factored in the condition and completeness of some of the sets. It was insane. I couldn't stop grinning as I went through it all. It felt like I'd stumbled onto the jackpot of childhood nostalgia, and the best part was knowing I'd gotten it all for $120. I was a student from New York studying abroad. I was painfully lonely and felt that I wanted an escape from my life that didn't involve anyone from London or any of my friends from home. I tried to find a pen pal on Craigslist by posting in the strictly platonic section in California, as I didn't want to talk to any British people and wasn't interested in speaking to people on the East Coast. I suppose it was clear from my post that I was a woman, and I got a fuck ton of really creepy emails. I tried again, asking only for emails from women. Again, more really creepy emails from men. Finally, I found a strictly platonic ad from a middle-aged man looking for another man to email back and forth because he didn't have friends and wanted someone to talk to. He seemed like an interesting guy, so I changed the name on the email I used for Craigslist, a throwaway email, so that it said an obviously manly name instead of my clearly feminine one. I sent him a long email, and he responded back. We clicked immediately, we had a lot to talk about, we're both clearly super fucking lonely, and both had a love for fish. This correspondence goes on for a while, without a hitch. There were a few hiccups, as I would sometimes send emails in the middle of the night because of the UK/US time difference. but he assumed I was just up late studying. At one point, I forgot my fake name, but I was able to play it off by saying that I had a different given name, but everyone called me the other name as a nickname. The man began discussing his life as a single gay male serving as a caretaker for his mother. His brother was also gay, but he was married, and the guy I was emailing clearly had a lot of weird feelings about it. I'm a queer woman, so I was able to relate to a lot of what he said. We had a lot of interesting talks about theology and sexuality, our upbringings, and how they informed our lives as gay people, and the uncomfortable family dynamics we both enjoyed. Over a few months, we become really close. We email several times every day, often sharing links to cool things we've read, and even exchanging pictures of interesting things we're seeing, with me being careful not to reveal that I was in England. It was incredibly cathartic to connect with someone else like this, even if the person I was communicating with believed that I was also a gay young man. Until one day, this guy sends me a long email professing his love for this fictional person I've fabricated, asking me to please come to visit him on the West Coast to start our lives together. At this point, I know this guy pretty well, and I know it's a big deal for him to ask someone to do something like that for him. I didn't really know what to do. Of course, I'd lied to him about a lot of the aesthetics of who I was, but I also truly felt a connection with him and genuinely cared about him. I knew he was serious about how he felt. I didn't know what to do, so I did nothing. I logged out of the email address, and I haven't logged in since. Moved back to America. No idea what happened to the guy. And that is how I became a catfish, thanks to the strictly platonic page on Craigslist. Note: I'm female and some houses nearby are also known meth labs. I live in a slightly rural spot. One night, after about midnight, I hear banging on my door. I thought it was my boyfriend attempting a booty call, as he is apt to do. When I got to the door, I could see through the small glass window, but instead of my boyfriend, I saw the side of an unfamiliar bearded face. He didn't see me, and I backed away from the door. My house was in a cellular dead zone, so I knew my cell was useless. I grabbed the landline next to my bed to call 911, but the line was dead. It was just like a horror movie, where the killer cuts the phone line. Meanwhile, the guy was still pounding away and slurring, "Let me in." I grabbed the biggest chef knife I own, which is pretty fucking big, and locked myself in the bathroom. I stood on the edge of the tub, behind the shower curtain, figuring I might have a chance if I jumped on him from above and stabbed him between the neck and shoulder when he tried to bust down the door. I was terrified, but also pleased with my plan, and waited. He started working his way around the outside of the house. I could hear him sliding his hands along the siding and banging his fist against the walls. For a split second I reveled in my surprisingly badass plan. Then I realized the sabotaged phone hadn't been charged in days. Maybe one of the other handsets still worked? I have never felt more fear than the moment I climbed down from my hiding spot, unlocked the bathroom door, and went in search of a second handset, all while a madman was moving around the outside of my house violently, trying to unlock every door and window. I found a phone, and it worked. I dialed 911, but the closest officer was over 15 minutes away. I was told to stay on the line, but locked myself in the bathroom again. That was the longest 15 minutes of my life. When police arrived, they had me identify a cuffed scruffy drunk off his ass dirty hippie kid. Apparently there had been a party down the road. He got disoriented and thought my house was his friend's house. He was trying to get back inside the party for 20 minutes of pure terror. So keep your phones charged, people. Every time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear footsteps upstairs. It starts at one end of the room, casually walks to the other, and then stops. This happens maybe twice a night. I didn't notice it as a kid, but that changed when I was about 14 and started sleeping in a different room on the first floor. My grandparents had begun sleeping in separate bedrooms, and both their rooms were on the first floor, leaving the upstairs completely empty at night. For as long as I can remember, I've been uneasy about the upstairs at their house. I don't know why, but it's always given me the creeps. Even now, at 23, I won't go up there alone. There's one room in particular that really sets me on edge. It's this long, narrow bedroom with closets on either side of the door, a bed placed roughly in the middle of the room, and a single window at the far end. Growing up, my grandparents used to tell me this bizarre story about the sons of the previous owner. They claimed they'd seen a gorilla come out of one of the closets at night, dance around the room, and then go back into the closet. As a kid, I thought it was just a weird story meant to spook me. I didn't take it seriously until I started sleeping in the room directly below it. The first night it happened, I was lying in bed, still awake. The house was completely dark, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood. Then I heard it, thump, thump, thump. The sound started at one end of the room upstairs and slowly moved toward me. It passed right above where I was lying and continued to the other end of the room before stopping. My heart was pounding as I lay there, wide awake and terrified. I knew exactly what I'd heard. Those were footsteps. That deliberate, casual pace was unmistakable. I bolted out of bed and went straight to my grandpa's room. Shaking, I told him what I'd heard. He brushed it off, saying, "The house is old. It creaks." To help me feel safer, he turned on the dining room light and sent me back to bed. I tried to convince myself he was right, that it was just the house settling. I crawled back into bed, determined to sleep. But then it started again. This time, the footsteps began where they had stopped, at the far end of the room by the window. They walked over me again, and when they reached the door, they stopped. I held my breath, waiting. 5 seconds later, I heard the sound of footsteps descending the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence as they hit the landing. Then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then, silence again as they reached the first floor. I was frozen with fear. Whatever it was now on my floor. My eyes locked onto the doorway to my room, where the dining room light shone faintly in. I was trembling, trying to stay calm, but my vision started to blur, and I felt dizzy with terror. That's when I heard it, a scratching sound coming from inside my room. I knew exactly where it was coming from, my grandpa's gun case. The sound was distinct, long, deliberate scratches against the wood. I could even hear the door of the case tapping softly against the frame, as if whatever was scratching it was moving it ever so slightly. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. It took all the strength I had to take a deep breath and let out a loud, desperate scream. Within seconds, my grandpa was in the room, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But, of course, he didn't believe me. He told me it was just my imagination, and that I should try to get some rest. I wasn't taking any chances. I grabbed a sheet, draped it over the side of the bed, and decided to sleep underneath it. I wrapped myself tightly in a comforter, put on headphones, and turned my back to the door. Whatever was in that house could throw a ghostly dance party in my room for all I cared. I wasn't going to see or hear a thing. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma what had happened. She just chuckled and said, "Oh, that's silly. You know, your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here, saying, 'I hear footsteps.'" That sent a shiver down my spine. Clearly, I wasn't the only one. For the rest of that visit, I slept under the bed, curled up with my headphones and comforter, doing everything I could to block out the sounds of the house. I've stayed at their house countless times since, and without fail, I hear the footsteps upstairs. They always start at one end of the room, walk across, and stop. I've learned to ignore them, sleeping on top of the bed now, but always keeping my back to the door and my headphones on. Not a home alone story, but definitely an at work alone story. I work graveyard shifts at Quick Mart, and for 8 hours straight, I'm the only one in the store. When I first started, the eerie quiet and strange noises of the night shift threw me off, but after about 5 months on the job, I've mostly gotten used to them. Mostly. When I first started, though, a customer told me something that stuck with me. Apparently, an old man used to work at this store, but he passed away from a stroke about 2 years back. They said he was well-liked and had worked there for years. The customer mentioned it in passing, like it was some fun trivia, but it planted a seed in my mind. It wasn't exactly comforting to think about while working alone at night. A couple of days later, I was working a swing shift when the graveyard guy came in for the shift change. As we were chatting, he asked me if I had any questions about the store. I figured I had most of the routines down, but then he said, "Hey, let me show you something." He led me to the back room, where he pointed out an old jacket hanging on a hook. "That belonged to the old guy," he said. "The manager loved him and couldn't bring herself to throw it out." Then he added, almost offhandedly, "Sometimes on graveyard shifts, you'll hear weird noises. People say it's him." I laughed it off at the time, but that jacket and the thought of weird noises stayed with me. Over the next few days, small, explainable things started happening. A cooler door would pop open, then slowly close again. A can of Arizona iced tea would tumble off a shelf for no apparent reason. It was always stuff you could brush off as random coincidences or the quirks of an old building. Still, every time it happened, I'd get that weird feeling, like maybe there was more to it than just faulty hinges or gravity. Then one night, I was sitting at the counter, scrolling through Reddit like I usually do to pass the time, when I heard a scuffling noise from the other side of the store. It lasted for about 5 seconds, and it was enough to make me pause. My first thought was, oh great, is this the ghost? I worked up the courage to go check it out, and when I got to the aisle, I found a packet of ramen sitting by the sugar. Now, this wasn't just a misplaced item from a customer. The packet was a good 5 feet away from the container it was supposed to be in, and it wasn't just lying there. It was angled like it had been dragged. That's when my curiosity really kicked in. Was something or someone messing with me? I decided to investigate. Channeling my inner FBI agent, I set up my iPhone to record the aisle for 30-minute sessions. If something moved that ramen packet, I wanted to catch it in the act. I recorded 2 full sessions, and nothing happened. The packet didn't budge. Frustrated, I picked up my phone and went back to work. Not 5 minutes later, I heard the scuffling noise again. My paranoia shot through the roof. Was this the ghost trying to mess with me for poking around? I didn't have an answer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was happening. The next day, my manager came in and asked how my night went. I hesitated, then gave her a look like, "Do you ever hear strange stuff around here?" She must have caught on because she raised her eyebrows and said, "Oh, do you mean Frank?" At this point, my stomach dropped. She said it so casually, like it was common knowledge. I couldn't believe it. "Wait," I said, "are you talking about the old man who died here 2 years ago?" She burst out laughing. "No, not him. I mean Frank the mouse. He's been here forever. Loves our ramen packs." Turns out, it wasn't a ghost haunting me after all. Just a very persistent, and oddly named, mouse who had developed a taste for instant noodles. My manager explained that Frank had been around for ages, sneaking snacks in the dead of night and spooking new employees like me. I didn't know whether to laugh or feel embarrassed, but I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. For weeks, I'd let my imagination run wild, convinced I was dealing with the ghost of the old man. Instead, it was just Frank the ramen-loving mouse causing chaos. Okay, this is 100% true. I'm 23 now, and this happened about 10 years ago, so I was probably 13 or 14. Anyway, I used to skateboard all the time with my friends Tim and Brandon. One day, we got done skating, and we decided to go to July 11th to get some food/drinks before we went home. Remember, I was only 13/14, so we weren't driving. We had skated to the July 11th, and were planning on skating/walking back home. Anyway, we buy our drinks, and we left the store. We walked to the parking lot's exit and prepared to cross the highway. It's not a bust highway, since it's a small town. While we waited for the traffic light to turn red, so that we could cross, I looked behind me at the 7-Eleven gas pumps. I noticed a 40 to 50-year-old man pumping gas into his white truck. He stared at me, and before I knew it, he dropped the gas pump and jumped into his truck. He slammed on the gas and sped straight at my friends and I. He missed us, but he grazed my arm and knocked my skateboard out of my hand. My friend, Brandon, screamed, "WTF, you fucking dick," as the man peeled out and sped into the parking lot next to 7-Eleven. I swear to God, he drove through a ditch, which was between 7-Eleven's parking lot and the parking lot he was in, and tried to run us over again. This is where it got bad. The 3 of us started running at full speed, across the highway and toward the local library, which is like 2 to 3 blocks from July 11th. When we were about 1/2 a block away, I looked back and saw the maniac speeding toward us, full of rage. Brandon and Tim ran up to the library doors, and I ran towards the woods. It was Sunday, so I knew the library was closed, and there was a trail in the woods which led to my backyard. Meanwhile, this maniac peeled into the parking lot and hopped out of his truck. I looked behind me before escaping into the woods and saw him grab either a shotgun or a crowbar. I was pretty far away at this point, and I was freaking out, so my vision wasn't great from the bed of his truck. I ran all the way home. When I got to my street, my neighbor, Tim's dad, told me to get in his car because we had to go to the video store, which is where Tim's mom worked. When I got there, I found Tim and Brandon. They ran to the video store after realizing that the library was closed, and 3 cops. A minute later, my mom came in, crying her eyes out because Brandon and Tim told her they didn't know if I lived or not. Everyone had thought that I was captured. Tim told me that he saw the guy running after me into the woods, which is scary because I thought the maniac was chasing them, not me. Anyway, he was never caught, and I spent the next 5 years worrying about every white truck I saw. Edit. I forgot the most scary part. Angry face, my town is small, but it's not empty. There were plenty of people around while this was going on. I felt so helpless, running for my life, while there were at least 100 people around, not doing a thing about it. Also, to be clear, we didn't provoke this man at all. He tried to hit us for no reason, and that's creepy. Brandon called him a dick, but that was after he tried to run us over. We were good kids, trying to walk home, and we almost died/got seriously hurt because of it. Surprised face. Also, bust highway equals busy highway. When I was a little kid, maybe 5 or 6, we had this neighbor who was like a grandmother to me. She lived nearby, and I'd go over to her house all the time. She always had snacks ready for me, and she had this old Mr. Potato Head toy that had belonged to her son, who was now grown up. For some reason, that toy sticks out in my memory, like one of those weird core childhood memories you can't shake. I'd sit there for hours playing with it while she chatted with my mom or worked around the house. Her son, who had been away for years, off in the army, I think, came home when I was still little. I don't remember a lot about him. He was in his 20s, tall, with that sort of quiet, intense demeanor that makes you notice someone without really understanding why. He seemed nice enough at first, but my mom wasn't convinced. She was polite to him, but I remember her being uneasy when he was around, though she couldn't exactly say why. One day, he asked about taking my older brothers camping. It wasn't an unusual request out in the country where we lived. People did stuff like that all the time, fishing trips, hikes, nights spent out by the creek under the stars. But my mom said no firmly. She told me later she had a weird feeling about him, and she wasn't taking any chances. For context, we lived way out in the country. It wasn't even a town, really, just a dot on the map. Everyone knew everyone else, and nobody locked their doors. It was the kind of place where people trusted their neighbors without question. So when my mom told him no, it wasn't because of any concrete reason, just a gut instinct that something wasn't right. Not long after that, my mom ran into him at the little general store in our area. He had bee stings all over his arms and neck, and she asked him what had happened. He told her he'd gotten them out by the creek. That struck her as strange, because we all spent tons of time at the creek and had never seen anything like that. It wasn't the kind of place where bees were a problem. She didn't push him about it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his explanation didn't add up. A little while later, I don't know exactly how long, maybe weeks, maybe months, the news broke about a murder. A couple and their child had been found dead at a campsite not far from where we lived, out in the woods past the creek. It was the kind of thing that just didn't happen in our area. People were shocked. Everyone was talking about it, speculating about who could have done such a thing. There were no leads, no suspects, just this terrible tragedy hanging over the community. That's when my mom's uneasy feeling about our neighbor's son came rushing back. She remembered the bee stings and how strange his explanation had been. It was a long shot, but she decided to call the police. She told them it was probably nothing, but she thought they should know about him and his odd behavior. I still vividly remember the day detectives came to our house to talk to her. I didn't understand much of what was going on at the time, but I could tell it was serious. My mom told them everything she'd noticed, the bee stings, the camping invitation, her gut feeling that something wasn't right. They listened carefully and took notes, thanking her for coming forward. Later, we found out they already had some evidence pointing toward him, though not enough to make an arrest. They told my mom there were things that matched, things that made him a strong suspect in their eyes, but they didn't have enough to charge him. The case remained unsolved, though one of the detectives later told her privately that he was sure it was him. He just couldn't prove it in court. The murders haunted the community for years. People speculated about what had happened, how someone could do such a thing. My mom felt sick about it, especially knowing that the detectives believed it was him, but couldn't bring him to justice. I think she carried a lot of guilt for not being able to do more, even though she'd done everything she could. A few years later, the truth about him came out in a different way. He was arrested for the abduction and attempted murder of a woman. She had run out of gas, and he had offered her a ride. Thankfully, she managed to escape and survived to tell her story. He went to prison for that crime, and as far as I know, he's still there. I lived in a bizarre little house as a child. It was incredibly tall and thin, like an attached house except freestanding, with 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. It was full of quirks, such as 2 fully functional fireplaces, a shower stall in the center of the basement, a backyard so small that you could not take 5 paces without hitting the fence, and an old-timey rope-pull dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to my bedroom. I loved that weird little place, but unfortunately it was incredibly old, and half of its charm was the fact that it seemed to have been designed by an inarticulate conclave of lunatics. And eventually the repair costs exceeded what my parents were willing to sink into it, and we had to move. Preparing for the move was a chore. I packed most of my stuff myself, and I had taken to throwing stuff down the dumbwaiter and shoving all my clothes so thickly in my closet that they became a single, solid brick of fabric. While clearing that closet out, in fact, I came across a feature I hadn't noticed before, an attic entrance in the roof. Being an adventurous kid, I opened her up, stood on the clothes brick, and began my first and last exploration into the topmost part of our weird little house. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't as dark as it should have been. The place was strung with old, red Christmas lights which still burned with leftover incandescents, and a dozen little cracks and holes peeped down into all the bedrooms below. The second thing I noticed was that the place was set up for habitation. The insulation was plasticked away, there was an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and a rusted mint green refrigerator which still worked when I tested it. The third thing was the bones. There were a lot of bones. I was a kid at the time, with a limited understanding of anatomy, but there were bones of all types heaped into a series of piles around the center of the attic. Small and large, clean and white, from every and any imaginable sort of creature, haphazardly stacked in a half-dozen osseous clumps. 2 of them were blackened, as if someone had tried to burn them, and the walls nearest those blackened piles were scrawled in dark bone char messages. Mostly they were just smears, but the word sorry appeared more than once. That room had been sitting over my head for 8 years while I slept. I lived in a bizarre little house as a child. It was incredibly tall and thin, like an attached house except freestanding, with 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. It was full of quirks, such as 2 fully functional fireplaces, a shower stall in the center of the basement, a backyard so small that you could not take 5 paces without hitting the fence, and an old-timey rope-pulled dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to my bedroom. I loved that weird little place, but unfortunately it was incredibly old, and half of its charm was the fact that it seemed to have been designed by an inarticulate conclave of lunatics. And eventually the repair costs exceeded what my parents were willing to sink into it, and we had to move. Preparing for the move was a chore. I packed most of my stuff myself, and I had taken to throwing stuff down the dumbwaiter and shoving all my clothes so thickly in my closet that they became a single, solid brick of fabric. While clearing that closet out, in fact, I came across a feature I hadn't noticed before, an attic entrance in the roof. Being an adventurous kid, I opened her up, stood on the clothes brick, and began my first and last exploration into the topmost part of our weird little house. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't as dark as it should have been. The place was strung with old, red Christmas lights which still burned with leftover incandescents, and a dozen little cracks and holes peeped down into all the bedrooms below. The second thing I noticed was that the place was set up for habitation. The insulation was plasticked away, there was an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and a rusted mint green refrigerator which still worked when I tested it. The third thing was the bones. There were a lot of bones. I was a kid at the time, with a limited understanding of anatomy, but there were bones of all types heaped into a series of piles around the center of the attic. Small and large, clean and white, from every and any imaginable sort of creature, haphazardly stacked in a half-dozen osseous clumps. 2 of them were blackened, as if someone had tried to burn them, and the walls nearest those blackened piles were scrawled in dark bone char messages. Mostly they were just smears, but the word sorry appeared more than once. That room had been sitting over my head for 8 years while I slept. My high school GF called late one night after I was home and in bed. She said that something had happened and asked if I could come over. She was clearly shaken and not full of details, so I told my parents and drove over towards her house. At the top of her subdivision, I was met by a cop with lights on. He asked where I was going, and I told him about the call from my GF. He lets me go by, and I come over the hill to the cul-de-sac where she lives, and I see multiple cop cars around the circle. They watch me pull up and get out of my car. My GF comes running out of her house and meets me in the street. She explains that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started beating her with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and headed to my GF's house, where she started banging furiously on the front door. My GF's dad was out of town, so her mom answered the door, and the neighbor just fell into the foyer bleeding profusely from the head. Her mom looks up to see the attacker headed up the walkway towards the front door. She pulls the neighbor into the house and closes the door, hitting the attacker with it before it fully closed. He then took the heavy tool he had used to beat the neighbor and smashed the little window at the top of the door. Her mom started screaming, and the attacker just turned around and walked up the street into the darkness. I spent the night there that night, along with 2 or 3 cops outside in their cars, and in the morning we could see blood still pooled on the floor in the foyer and splattered blood above the front door from where the attacker had swung the bloody tool to smash the window. No one was ever caught or even identified. It was just completely random. The neighbor survived and, to my knowledge, had no permanent physical injuries beyond scarring from having her scalp stapled shut. She moved away shortly after the incident. GF's neighbor was brutally attacked in her home. She ran to my GF's house, and the attacker fled after nearly getting into their house too. No one was ever caught. I was around 10 years old, just an average school day like any other. That morning, my mom mentioned she was thinking of taking me to the doctor in the afternoon because of a recurring issue I had with my eye. It wasn't anything urgent, just one of those keep an eye on it situations, so I didn't think much of it. She wasn't even sure if she'd booked the appointment, but she told me to be ready just in case. By lunchtime, I'd completely forgotten about it. I was sitting in the dining hall with my friends, eating and chatting, when one of the school office staff came over to me. She told me there was a taxi waiting outside, and I needed to go. My immediate thought was that my mom must have arranged it. She couldn't drive, so taking taxis was pretty normal for us. I figured she'd gone ahead and booked one to get me out of school for the doctor's appointment. Feeling a little self-conscious about leaving in the middle of the day, I cleared up my lunch tray, grabbed my school bag, and headed for the door. As I was about to walk out, I suddenly remembered my jacket was still in my classroom. It was one of those chilly days where forgetting your jacket meant being miserable later, so I rushed back to grab it. By the time I got back to the front office, the woman at the desk told me the taxi had left. Just like that, gone without me. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Not because I was scared of the situation, but because I thought my mom was going to be furious. She'd booked a taxi, gone out of her way to arrange everything, and I'd blown it by being late. I shuffled back to class, feeling anxious and upset, and spent the rest of the day stewing over how mad she was going to be. When school let out, I walked to the gate, dreading the confrontation. My mom was waiting for me like always, and as soon as I saw her, I burst into tears. Between sobs, I apologized over and over, telling her I'd missed the taxi she'd booked for me and begging her not to be angry. She looked at me, completely confused. "What taxi?" she asked. I stopped crying for a second and just stared at her. "The one you sent for me to go to the doctor." Her face went pale. "I didn't send a taxi," she said. "I don't know what you're talking about." At first, I thought maybe she was trying to trick me for some reason, or maybe she'd forgotten she'd booked it. But no, she was serious. She hadn't called a taxi, hadn't spoken to the school, hadn't made the appointment. The realization hit us both at the same time. Someone else had sent that taxi. She grabbed my hand and walked me home as quickly as she could, her grip tight the whole way. When we got inside, she sat me down and asked for every detail I could remember. I told her about the office lady saying the taxi was outside, how I thought it was for the doctor, how I'd gone back for my jacket and missed it. She just kept shaking her head, muttering, "Who would do that?" Later, she called the school to ask about it. The office staff remembered telling me the taxi was there, but said they didn't know who had booked it. They just assumed it was my mom, the same way I had. Nobody had checked, nobody questioned it. Back then, it wasn't unusual for parents to send taxis to pick up their kids if something came up, so no one thought twice about it. The driver, whoever they were, didn't come into the school. They stayed parked outside, waiting. And when I didn't show up quickly enough, they left. For days afterward, my mom couldn't stop talking about it. She kept saying how lucky I was to have forgotten my jacket. If I hadn't gone back for it, I would have climbed into that taxi without a second thought, completely unaware of who was driving or where they were planning to take me. She didn't like to dwell on the what-ifs, but I could tell it haunted her. It still haunts me. Who sent that taxi? Was it someone who knew me, someone who'd been watching? Or was it random, a spur-of-the-moment thing by someone who saw an opportunity? I don't think we'll ever know. What I do know is that it changed the way my mom handled everything from that point forward. She started double-checking everything, making sure people knew exactly where I was supposed to be and who was supposed to pick me up. She even got stricter with the school, insisting they verify with her directly if I was ever being taken out during the day. When I was about 13 or 14, I lived on a farm in NC. This wasn't a regular farm that you would expect with fields full of beans and shit. It was actually a pine tree harvestery. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and so we lived basically in the woods and would bale the pine straw every year. Whatever, the point is that my house was in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined longleaf pines. My living room had a huge picture window. I won't go into the architecture of the house, but it was a weird custom job built by some dentist in the 30s. The window in the living room stretched nearly the entire length of the room, maybe 50 feet. The house was built on a subtle hill, so the living room itself sat 5 or 6 feet off the ground, so you had something of an angle to look out at a solid mile of pine trees. During the winter it was unsettling, because you'd get just a bit of snow, enough to reflect moonlight, so that you could see the dogs running around at night. I'll be honest, I hated that room and that window. So now to the relevant part. I had a cousin over for the weekend, and we were doing what kids do in the country, throwing stuff in the fireplace to see what happens. It is getting late, and the fire is dying down, so we build the big kingdom of couch cushions and blankets in the living room and get ready for bed. Nothing out of the ordinary until we hear the dogs barking. They were really far away. The property stretches for nearly a mile, so I just assumed they were chasing off whatever animal felt like shitting in my yard. So my cousin is staring out the window and not saying anything, which prompts the standard, "What's up?" He just kind of keeps staring and says he feels like he's seeing things. Naturally, I get all anxious and start staring out the window as well. Nothing happens for a few minutes, and he gets more and more annoyed with me because I'm asking what he saw. He keeps shushing me so that he can focus. And then we both see it. A shadow of a person moves from one tree to the next. Not a run, not a leap, just a brisk walk from one tree to another. This is probably 100 yards out from the house. We can't actually tell if the person is coming closer or not because we're dealing with moonlight reflecting off of snow/slush/ice. I guess the crazy part is that we didn't so much freak out, because at this point there is still that chance that we didn't see what we saw, you know? So we just kept staring. We should have gone to wake up my dad, but he's an idiot and the kind of guy to walk out on the patio and holler into the woods with his rifle. We were just scared enough to agree that we don't want to taunt whatever is happening. So about 3 minutes later, it happens again, but a good 50 feet from where we first saw it. Another person, another tree, a few strides, and they were gone. This happened every few minutes for the next half hour, and we just stared. At this point I should mention that I didn't really have neighbors. The land surrounding our farm was federal paper. I don't know who owns it now, so it was miles and miles of uncultivated trees. You don't see people around the farm unless they intend to be there. So we keep watching as these two figures intermittently appear and vanish until finally we see one appear, but not disappear. Instead we focus in on it and see that it is now running forward. We lose our shit and go wake my dad. By the time we get into the room with my half-awake father, there is no one to be seen. We sprint around locking doors and windows. Keep in mind that we're out in the country with no one around. It rarely occurs to lock doors. Every door was worse than the last because you just know that as soon as you reach the door, someone is going to be trying to open it, although that never happened. We locked everything up, walked around the house at least 50 times making sure no one got in without us knowing, and then convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us while we stared out the window. I never understood why my dad wouldn't call the police. He always had this "we take care of our own" mentality, and it simply wasn't an option to call 911. The next day we went out to look, and absolutely, there were footprints everywhere in the snow. We saw them between trees, and then we finally saw where someone had been standing right in front of the window. But as I said, I wouldn't have seen them because while I'm 7 feet up in the living room, they would have been right beneath me. When I was learning to drive, my instructor advised me to always lock my car doors as soon as I get into my car. I asked her why, and she told me her personal experience. This happened almost a year after she passed her test. She finished work about 3 a.m. She just gotten into her car and gotten her keys in the ignition when 3 guys jumped into her car. She had a knife to her neck and was told to drive. They give her directions to an alleyway. They dragged her out of the car and raped her. After they were done with her, they left her in the alleyway and stole her car and purse. It took her a while to get help. Police did find her car a few days later, abandoned and on fire, on the outskirts of the city. But the guys were not caught. The reason she started to teach driving was her way to protect other women and make sure no one else goes through what she went through. So she advised all her female students to lock their car doors as soon as they get in. I'm still in contact with my instructor via social media. I sent her screenshots of this comment and the other comments. She is happy that her advice/warning is out there before she retires for health reasons. She wants me clear a misunderstanding that she saw in the comments. She does give the same advice to her male students, and she does tell them her experience, but leave out the rape part. She does get messages from her past students, including me, saying thank you for the advice/warning, and we tell her about our close calls. A message of her, thank you for sharing your experience and advice, so that others can be safe and they don't go through the same experience. When I was about 18, I had one of those nights that started as harmless fun, but ended up being something I'll never forget. My friends and I had gone into town for a night out. We were all young and looking to blow off some steam, so naturally we went all in. By 2 a.m., I was completely wasted. I couldn't see straight, couldn't walk straight, and thinking straight wasn't even an option. Thankfully, one of my friends had stayed sober to drive us home. He was the responsible one of the group, and honestly, it probably saved us that night. We stumbled to the parking lot where our designated driver's car was parked. The air was cold and sharp, doing little to clear my head, and all I wanted was to collapse into the back seat and pass out. But then, through the haze of my drunken stupor, I heard something, a faint whimpering sound. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just some drunken auditory hallucination, but it didn't go away. I turned around, squinting into the darkness, and that's when I saw them. 2 guys were carrying a girl toward a car. It was hard to make out what was happening at first, but the closer I got, the clearer it became. The girl was clearly drunk, her legs barely supporting her weight as they half-dragged, half-carried her. At first glance, it might have looked like they were helping a friend get to a car, but then I heard her voice, faint and slurred but unmistakable. She kept saying, "No," and "I don't want to," over and over. In that moment, adrenaline hit me like a freight train. It was like a switch flipped in my brain, and the alcohol left my system entirely. I was stone-cold sober. There was no question in my mind about what was happening. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a drunken mix-up. This girl was in serious trouble, and those guys weren't taking her to safety. I didn't think. I just acted. I screamed at them, loud enough to echo through the empty parking lot, and pulled out my phone to call the police. The 2 guys froze for a second, looking like deer caught in headlights. Then, realizing they'd been spotted, they moved faster. They managed to get her into the car before I could get close enough to physically stop them, and they sped off into the night. My hands were shaking as I relayed everything to the woman on the other end of the 911 call. I described the scene as best as I could, stumbling over my words in my urgency. Then I remembered the most important detail. I'd seen their license plate. I gave her the number, praying it was enough for them to track the car down. She reassured me that they were dispatching officers immediately and would use the license plate to locate them. For the next 10 minutes, my friends and I stood in the parking lot, too shaken to say much. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the girl's voice, the way she'd kept saying no, and the look of panic on her face as they shoved her into the car. It was terrifying, and the what-ifs swirled around in my mind. What if I hadn't heard her? What if I'd been too drunk to notice? What if I hadn't gotten their license plate? Then my phone buzzed. It was the police. They told me they'd stopped the car and arrested the 2 guys. The girl was safe, and they were taking her to the hospital to make sure she was okay. Hearing that was like a weight being lifted off my chest. She was safe. That was all that mattered. Afterward, the enormity of what had just happened started to sink in. That girl had been a stranger, someone I'd never met and probably would never meet again. But in that moment, her safety became the most important thing in the world. The thought of what could have happened to her if I hadn't been there, if I hadn't noticed, still makes my stomach turn. The whole thing shook me to my core. It was a stark reminder of how quickly something can go from just a normal night out to a life-or-death situation. It also made me realize how important it is to speak up, even when you're unsure or scared. There were a lot of people in that parking lot that night, but I was the one who noticed and acted. It makes me wonder how many people saw what I saw and chose to look the other way. Even now, years later, I think about that night sometimes. It was a defining moment for me, one that taught me how crucial it is to trust your instincts and act on them. It also showed me the importance of staying vigilant, of watching out for the people around you, even if they're strangers. I'll never forget the girl's voice, her repeated no, and how those 2 guys didn't care. They just wanted to get away before anyone noticed. And I'll never forget the relief I felt when the police told me they'd found her, safe and alive. That night could have ended so much worse. But it didn't because I listened, I acted, and I refused to ignore what was right in front of me. I don't think I'm a hero or anything. I just did what I hope anyone else would do in the same situation. But I'll always be grateful that I was there, and that, for once, everything worked out the way it should have. This happened in Germany, but it's something that could happen anywhere. It's a reminder to always be aware of your surroundings, and to never hesitate when you see someone who might need help. You never know, you might be their only chance. A few years ago, my fiancée and I bought a foreclosed home in a not-so-great neighborhood. The price was incredible, and we thought we were smart for snagging such a deal. Now looking back, we realize how naive we were. The house was fine, but the neighborhood? Not so much. Moments like this one still make me question how we didn't see it coming. It was a late night, just me at home. My fiancée was working the late shift, and I couldn't sleep, so I was half watching a crime show on TV while lying in bed. It was around 2 a.m., and I was caught in that hazy in-between of being awake and dozing off when I heard a scratching noise. It was coming from the window that was only a foot away from me in bed. At first, I thought must be squirrels. We'd seen them scampering around the yard plenty of times, and this seemed like a reasonable assumption. I was already halfway dismissing it when the squirrels started cursing and mumbling. That's when my brain fully woke up, and a wave of panic hit me. That wasn't wildlife. That was a person. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a screwdriver jamming into the window frame, trying to pry it open. I froze for a split second, my mind racing. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I have a gun. I'm calling the cops. I yelled like a madwoman, channeling every ounce of terror into making it sound like I was ready to fight to the death. The scratching stopped immediately. Whoever was out there didn't wait to test if I was bluffing. By the time I got off the bed and peeked out the window, there was no one there. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding, and called 911. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me until the cops arrived. 2 officers showed up and searched the yard with flashlights. They didn't find anything. No footprints, no lingering meth head burglar, nothing. I could tell from their expressions that they probably thought I was overreacting. They were polite, though, and as they were walking back to their cruisers, I stood in the doorway, embarrassed but relieved. Then, as they were about to leave, their radios crackled to life. There'd been another break-in reported, just a few blocks away. The officers looked at each other, nodded, and took off toward the new call. I closed and locked the door, adrenaline still surging through me. I double-checked every lock in the house and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. About an hour later, my fiancé called me on his way home. He knew I was rattled, so he insisted I stay on the phone with him until he got back. Talking to him helped, at least for a moment, but then I heard something else, a heavy thumping sound. It came from the backyard, right where the wooden ramp to our shed was. "Oh, good, you're home," I said, immediately hanging up the call. I assumed it was him. Who else would be back there? I started walking to the back door, ready to meet him, but before I got there, my phone rang again. It was him calling me back. "I'm not home yet," he said, his voice serious. "I'm still a few minutes away. Stay inside and call 911. Panic surged again. I backed away from the door and called the cops for the second time that night. This time, I didn't bother holding back my fear. I told the dispatcher everything. The attempted break-in, the sounds in the backyard, how my fiancée wasn't home yet. She reassured me that officers were on their way. Within minutes, both my fiancée and the cops arrived at the same time. The officers swept the yard again, and this time, they had more to go on. Turns out, they'd been chasing the same guy all night, a meth head with a screwdriver who had been trying to break into several houses in the neighborhood. They'd been one step behind him the whole time, zigzagging from call to call. And then there was the cursing squirrels I'd heard earlier. One of the officers went to the bedroom window and noticed that the screen had been removed. When the would-be burglar pried it off, he disturbed a massive wasp nest that was hidden in the frame. Apparently, the buzzing swarm of angry wasps had done more to deter him than my yelling ever could. Those little wasps had been my tiny, unintentional defenders. The officer couldn't help but chuckle as he pointed out the nest, saying, "Looks like these guys deserve the credit tonight." It was ridiculous and terrifying all at once. My mind was racing with what could have happened if those wasps hadn't intervened, or if I hadn't screamed. For the rest of the night, I barely slept. My fiancée stayed up with me, checking the windows and doors every hour, even though we knew the cops were patrolling the neighborhood. The thought that this guy had been so persistent, circling back to the same few houses all night, was deeply unsettling. After that, we invested in better locks, motion sensor lights, and even a security camera. It didn't change the fact that we were living in a sketchy area, but at least it gave us a bit more peace of mind. Every time I look at that bedroom window, I think about how close that night came to being something much worse. There are some wonderful things about being young, poor, and in love. Sadly, this is about none of those things. When I was 22, I decided to move in with my equally poor boyfriend. Unfortunately, poor plus poor still equals mostly poor. But not so destitute that we couldn't afford an apartment in a college town. We happily moved into our little one-bedroom, first-floor apartment. Sure, it had problems. The lead-based paint was so thick we were sure we could survive a nuclear attack. The bathroom didn't have a vent. Instead, it had a window in the shower. The appliances were from the time of my grandmother. But it was home. Our home. We loved it. My boyfriend worked the graveyard shift, and I worked days, so we spent a lot of time apart. That meant that when we were together, we enjoyed the simple things in life. A lot of naked time. Over time, when I was waking up and taking my morning shower, my boyfriend, who was just getting home, realized that he could come up to our open shower window and sneak a peek. I always caught him. It was in good fun, and we laughed. Eventually, I started to notice there was a log standing upright outside of that window. I continually asked him why he would need that. He was tall enough already. He'd claim it wasn't his and move it away when I went outside to show him. Yet every few days, it would move right back. The guys who cared for the yard were there several times a week, so they must have just been moving it back out of the way against the building. Finally, before the snow fell, the yard workers cleared away all the yard debris, and we went on in peaceful oblivion, candy-coated, love-filled oblivion. Time went on, and our lease was up, but there was a great special at our cheap apartment complex. We could now rent 2 bedrooms, even cheaper than our 1 bedroom. We happily signed the new lease. The only real problem was that our 1-bedroom apartment was on a nice suburban street, facing houses, so we never really noticed how bad our neighborhood was. We were moved to the other end of the community, behind an abandoned strip mall. Our front yard consisted of a dark alley and some dumpsters behind a recently vacated Chinese buffet, where a lot of stray cats seemed to live. None of this mattered in our dimly lit front yard, though. Our apartment was super cheap and super huge. What more could we ask for? That year, we were so happy that my boyfriend went to buy me a ring on Valentine's Day. Being young and giddy in love, he wasn't able to keep the secret, and I told him yes before he could even ask the question. He didn't have a lot of money, so he bought a ring with the help of a friend's father who owned a jewelry store. He got a good price, but with the drop in price, so comes a drop in attention to detail. I was devastated when he brought home the ring, along with our wedding band set, to find out that someone had mistaken my very tiny 4-ring size with a 12. My rings were made for monster hands. What a terrible way to start our engagement. Clearly they needed to go back, so he put them in his glove box, but then a snowstorm prevented him from taking them back that day. The next day he went to his car to find that it had been broken into. Nothing had been taken, except the rings from the glove box. We never did have the money to replace them. We personally went to every pawn shop in the area, and everybody said they hadn't seen anything. I began to be jealous any time I'd see a woman with large fingers wearing a silver ring with Celtic knot work. I kept telling myself that her deadbeat boyfriend stole my ring to give to that whore. Winter passed and summer came. With the summer came the warm breezes and the fresh air through our open windows. What the summer didn't bring was more money, not for us and not for the city. We lost our phone service for non-payment, but it didn't matter. The only people we talked to were each other anyway. Meanwhile, the city cut police and even closed a few stations, most of them in our neighborhood. It didn't matter though. Summer days are long, and our dingy little corner of the community wasn't at all intimidating in the daylight. One night my husband-to-be turned in for the night early, and so I decided that after a long day, what I really needed was a nice soak in the bath. I walked into the bathroom and began to run the water, adding my bath salts and bubble bath. I opened the window for that nice summer breeze and took of my clothes and dumped them in a pile by the open bathroom door. I then grabbed my laptop to set on the closed toilet seat so I could relax in the tub with a movie. This would be at least 2 hours of pure bliss. Nothing beats a long soak in my book. I turned the volume up on my laptop and relaxed the hours away with one movie and then another. What must have been 4 hours later, I pulled the plug on the drain and sat while the water swirled away. I slowly stood up and stretched and dried off, the now cool night air hitting my face through the window. I figured I'd just leave that open though, the apartment could use the airing out. I stepped out of the tub and across the bathroom. I didn't bother to move my pile of clothes, instead stepping around them in a manner to get out the partially opened bathroom door. This move put me looking back into the bathroom, right out the window where I saw a tall man. At first I was startled, but quickly realized it was just my fiancé playing a trick on me, like he used to do at our old apartment. Then I saw his eyes, up too high in the window, and everything in my head began to swim. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I could only stand there, naked, and stare. Then everything came into startling detail. He was standing up on something so high up that I could see his full torso in the window. His full torso and his penis. There was a man outside my window jerking off. The motion drew my attention to his hand. Everything happened in a split second after I saw him, while I was frozen to the spot. I noticed he was wearing a silver ring with Celtic knotwork on it. I made a mental note of ways to identify him as I finally unfroze and ran to the bedroom. "There's a man outside the bathroom window," I said so fast my fiancé couldn't understand as he woke up. "What?" he asked. I repeated, "There's a man outside the bathroom window. He's jerking off. He was watching me. Oh my God, make him go away." I was finally in hysterics as everything sunk in. That man could have been there, hovering over me for hours. The only thing separating us was a thin screen. When I had stood up, his penis was inches from my face, his body towering over me. I just kept covering myself with blankets and telling my fiancé to make him go away. By the time my fiancé woke up and went to check on the situation, nobody was anywhere around. There was only a log standing upright like a step outside our bathroom window. In the aftermath, we filed a police report, but had no phones to call, so had to drive a good 20 minutes away to do so. Then they didn't have enough forces to do anything about the situation anyway. We didn't have the money to break our lease. Instead, we spent the rest of the year living in fear. I covered every window with black contact paper. I wedged boards into every window so they couldn't be opened. The bathroom window never again opened. I never left without pepper spray. I never left after dark. But for the rest of that year, most nights, I'd hear a faint noise outside our bedroom window, which was next to our bathroom. 9 years ago, I had met a person that to this day, I still wish I never did. I was an isolated, bullied, and depressed 8th grader, with the added state of being a plus-sized kid in a sport-centric town. So basically, I was beaten and ridiculed on a daily basis. I couldn't make any friends with my new classmates. All of my old friends from elementary school I got placed in different classes, and nobody was in the same after-school groups as me anymore. We were also all in a scout group, but that disbanded before I got into middle school. I was also lonely that if someone talked to me without picking on me, it made me happy. I had a Google Plus account, the only social media I could access at school, that I kept hidden from my parents, that I would use to check out my favorite fandoms and hopefully use to make some new friends. One day I was on Google Plus in the computer lab, and I had commented under a piece of fan art of a character I liked. The person who made the post had replied to me not even a minute later. I remember getting very excited seeing that notification, my heart swelling up in excitement. The two of us spent the next 10 minutes of my class talking to each other in the comments section. We ended up replying so much, we flooded a good portion of the comments with our talk. After I had to change classes, I logged back in on one of the Chromebooks we had stored in the back of the class, and saw that she actually messaged me. Her name was Haley. At least, she told me that was her name. But years later, I'm not as sure it was actually her name. In the message I got, Haley told me she was 2 years older than me, and that we had a lot of things in common. I spent the rest of the school day on my phone, not giving a damn to anything in my classes. We talked for the next week in our DMS until she suggested that we message each other in a private chat room. Later that day, we made a private chat on an online messaging site, and in our first conversation, we at first talked on messages. Then Haley asked if we could also do a voice call. I told her I wasn't sure, but she told me it was only to better hold a conversation with me. And eventually, after she asked me multiple times, I gave in. After an hour of us talking, she then suggested we video chat. I agreed, both to make sure she was actually my age, but also to put a name to a face. Haley turned on her camera, and she did look in the same age range as me. I don't know why, but that fact haunts me more than anything else. The fact that she looked so close to my age, plus that she easily smiled and spoke so friendly to me, made me feel that I had nothing to be afraid of. So that led to me quickly believe that I could trust her. We ended up talking for hours after, with me practically on cloud nine the entire time. In the beginning of our little friendship, things were going all right. We told each other about our schools, what we liked, and gushing over our favorite series we liked. We talked almost every day, and stayed up late talking nearly all night. We even exchanged a couple of silly pictures of ourselves and memes back and forth a lot. After we had been talking for 6 months, Haley asked me if I would like to meet her friends. At first, I was ecstatic, and the thought of having more friends made me so excited I didn't think twice before saying yes. Haley invites me in, and I got to meet her other friends. I had a completely different feeling about these people compared to what I felt with Haley. Something made me feel unsafe in that chat room, even though they all seemed nice, and that Haley reassured me I could trust them. It felt like my instincts were trying to warn me, but I wasn't sure about what, so I ignored it. Most of them were much older than me. In a chat with her main friends there were 6 other people. Most of them were 18-19, but there were 2 guys that I distinctly remember being in their 20s. I asked how they all met, and they told me they all met either on another social media site or from real life, but wouldn't answer any more of my questions. I was a bit naive, so all of the red flags that were popping up went completely over my head. From constant loud talking to frequently overlapping each other, the calls I were on with them were pure chaos. The messages were even worse, because they would frequently drop cuss words and topics that should not be brought up with someone who was still a minor. I tried building genuine connections with them, but they all acted dismissive to me and acted like I was annoying whenever I tried to talk in a conversation. Needless to say, I did not like them very much. Haley, on the other hand, was all about them. She would pull the exact same habits, jokes, dirty words, and all of that with the others. They could say something super problematic, but she would be laughing right along with them. I was shocked by this version of Haley, because she never acted like this with me when it was just the 2 of us. We still talked a bunch, but slowly, she was talking to her other friends more than she was with me. At first I thought it was fine, but the more she ignored my messages or didn't pick up my calls, the more I got bothered. When I called to confront Haley about blowing me off, she went ballistic on me, saying that I was being selfish and that I didn't want her to talk to her other friends because I was jealous. I explained that wasn't true, but she wouldn't listen and then hung up on me. Haley then ghosted me for almost a month, leaving me worried and upset over what happened. When she started talking to me again, I was so emotionally distraught. I was crying on our first call and apologizing for what I said the last time we talked. She told me it was fine, she just needed some time alone, and that she would talk to me a bit more. And indeed she did, although not what I thought she would. Haley began to tell me she had depression, and that was the reason she wouldn't talk to me for a month. I didn't judge her about it, and said whatever she needed to talk about she could come to me. This led to her trauma dumping on me nearly every day, talking about how shitty her home life was, and how bad her relationship was with her mom, and how much she hated herself. I was there to offer an ear and some kind words whenever Haley called or messaged me about it. This quickly became part of our routine. Almost daily, in the middle of us having any kind of conversation, she'd begin complaining about anything happening during her day. If not that, it would be about how ugly she thought she was or how much her life sucked and wanted to end things. The last one freaked me out the most. I was worried about her because we lived in different states and I couldn't help her in person. Every time she would become self-deprecating, I would say otherwise, giving her compliments and words of affirmation for so long my throat ached and felt raw. And then, just as fast as she'd bring it up, she dropped that conversation and we talked like we were before. Haley also began calling for long periods of time and messaging me late into the night. Phone calls would stretch for hours at a time, and her texts would come in until 3 or 4 in the morning. The thing was, it was mainly her talking now. Every phone call, she'd take over the conversation. If I didn't message her back quickly enough, she'd spam multiple texts back to back faster than I can read them. I would try to end them myself, but every time I would try, Haley would chastise me for wanting to leave our conversation when not long ago I wanted to have her attention. She basically guilt-tripped me back into talking to her, and it worked. Even if I had lost interest in our talks or didn't want her to message me during class, I would still let her talk and reply. At least I still had her attention, and she still wanted to talk to me. This all went on in a cycle for 2 years, and it left me feeling more anxious and exhausted than anything else ever did. It felt like we had nothing in common anymore, and she either ghosts me for a week or spends the entire weekend texting me nonstop. The topics of her self-worth have also gotten worse. They escalated to her messaging me goodbye, or I can't live like this anymore, without responding to any of my following messages or calls. Alongside of that, she would send me pictures of her, marking herself, telling me about how it felt to do it. The sight of those messages would send me into panic attacks, and every time I would panic and message her after, I would be sent into tears. Not only that, the group chat with her other friends got worse. Arguments broke out frequently, drama and gossip spread like an oil spill, and it led to people being blocked/unblocked almost every few days. I hated talking to them. They began ganging up on me in messages, and Haley was often the first one to make rude jokes about me that they would all laugh at. I began getting sick of it and would stop messaging and calling both Haley and her friends, despite her begging me to. One late night, while the group was in an argument over text, I hit my breaking point. I was tired of all the drama and them treating me like shit all the time. So I messaged the group chat that I had enough of them and privately messaged Haley that I needed a break. Then I left both chat rooms, blocked everyone I talked to, deleted my messaging account, and deleted the site from my computer's history. Once it was all over, I felt like I had been freed from some kind of prison, and all I could do was cry in relief and euphoria over the whole thing being over. I later found out that all of the pictures Haley had sent me were all stock images and photoshopped. I also found out from a bit of digging through her background, a lot of things didn't add up. I learned that she was actually a lot older than what she originally told me, at least 6 years older than me. Meaning that when we first met when I was 14, she was about 20 years old. Many things from our interactions still haunt me, especially the picture of her marks and her scathing self-deprecating messages. For almost 3 months, I would have nightmares about Haley getting back in contact with me and what she would say or do to me. I have many better friends now, and I am absolutely certain I will never have to hear from Haley again. But sometimes I still wonder who that woman really was, and what was it about me that she was interested in. Hopefully, I won't ever find out. So to Haley, if you somehow ever find this story, let's not meet again. Edit, for clarification, and the fact I got tired of explaining it in the comment section. The pictures she would send me when we would message each other were all pictures of her friends and family, places she claimed to have been to, and items she owned. A few weeks after I blocked Haley, I found them stored on my computer. I got curious, so I reversed image searched the pictures she sent me, and they were all stock photos. Every result I found from her picture led back to a stock photo site, with the only difference between them being that she cropped out the logo of the site from the pictures. Basically, I was lied to a lot.